Maverick railroad financier Robert R. Young was called the Tex Bad Boy, the gadfly of the railroads, and Little Napoleon. Young did have a portrait of Napoleon in his Newport, Rhode Island mansion, where he flew the Lone Star State flag. He was a promoter and a speculator who knew the value of advertising and how to use the media to get his message across. He was a fighter, taking on the bankers, railroads, and government. Once he grabbed hold of something, he couldn't let go. We should have seen it coming, the collapse of the American railroads. They were dominated by stock speculators and subjected to excessive taxation and regulation, while competing forms of transportation were subsidized. There was one stock speculator who didn't take the money and run. Instead, he took up the cause of the small investor, the Aunt Janes, as he called them. At 5 feet 6, 135 pounds, Robert Ralph Young knew all about the little guy. He was sometimes dubbed the smallest Texan in the world. Born February 14, 1897 in Canadian Texas, family members called him Ralph. He was one of 4 children, a runt of a boy with 2 nicknames. Punk, short for Pumpkinhead, because he had a large head and sandy auburn hair. Young's friend, Ed Hoover Jr., nicknamed Young Railroad because of his initials. Born of pioneer stock, his father, David John Young, managed the Moody Cattle Ranch. Then he became cashier and secretary in the founding of the Canadian Valley Bank, now the First National Bank of Canadian, with his father-in-law and cattle rancher, Robert Moody. In 1910, D.J. Young succeeded Moody as president of the bank and held the post until his death in 1927. Ralph's mother, Mary Arabella Moody Young, loved to paint and read poetry. She was very understanding of her children. John, Kenneth, Ralph, and Edith. Young was an excellent student, always at or near the top of his class. But the pint-sized, quick-witted leader of a little gang was up to more tricks than Huckleberry Finn. Once Punk and Ed sampled all the melons in his grandfather Moody's watermelon patch and blamed coyotes for the damage. Competition was in his bones. He learned to ride horses and handle guns. He loved to hunt rabbit, quail, and prairie chickens. On one outing, Young and a friend took some ducks from 2 boys, claiming the boys were trespassing. Young's father made his son apologize to the boys, give them the ducks, and a goose, and a deer Young had killed. He gave his son a licking and took away his gun. Young was always looking for an opportunity and willing to take a chance. In his first business deal, he teamed up with Clancy Fisher and sold novelties on consignment at a Sunday school picnic. They also sold lemonade and ran a game of chance. They split $7.65. Young is remembered for his expression, "I do all the work," in his days as a soda jerker at the H.J. Murrell drugstore. His mother died when he was 13, leaving a huge void in his life. He turned to poetry, rebelled against discipline. When his Aunt Edith moved to California, his father sent him along. She became the mother he lost. At the end of summer in 1912, Young's father sent him to Culver Military Academy. The 15-year-old rode on the Nickel Plate Railroad, a railroad he would later own. He was an expert rifleman and treasurer of the rifle team. He won a citation twice for the best room and 3 times for the best appearance. But as the yearbook noted, looks were deceiving, and he was always in the midst of any fun. He was exposed with 11 others as the school's most active crapshooters. He graduated at the head of his class in 1914, but refused to be the class valedictorian because of extreme shyness. Young returned home and worked at the bank. He had to liquidate the local pop stand, where he bought his first 10-cent cigars and smoked them with Ed. That summer of 1914 was Young's last in Canadian. His father remarried, but he never accepted his stepmother, Josephine. In the fall, Young left for the University of Virginia, making part of the trip on the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, another railroad he would later own. Young was at the university on a scholarship from Culver to study engineering and then law, but he spent more time playing poker and pool. Young believed if his college years had been shared with business, something he later promoted, he might have appreciated what education was for. Young preferred to move along with his life quickly, both economically and domestically. A friend had introduced him to Anita O'Keeffe, sister of the famous painter Georgia O'Keeffe. and he fell in love. He left college in 1916 at age 19 and married Anita, who was 25. Young took a job cutting rifle powder in New Jersey. Certainly as a hard-working all-night laborer at 28.5 cents an hour in a DuPont factory, I envied the softer life of the graduate chemist or engineer who landed initially a far better job. Young took a 2-year correspondence course in business administration while working his way up to the Treasurer's Department in Wilmington. There, top executives noticed him when he criticized DuPont's advertising. In 1918, Young and his wife had their first and only child, Eleanor Jane. In the fall of 1920, Young moved his family to New York, where he invested his Moody family inheritance. He lost everything, $5,000 on a new food processing invention and the rest in the stock market. Young was broke and humiliated. In 1922, Young was hired as a statistician at General Motors, making $100 a week. While rising to assistant treasurer at GM, Young studied investment literature and planned his own market deals. He resigned in 1929 to become treasurer of Pierre DuPont and John J. Raskop's private investment company. Young advised selling stocks. He walked away from the October 1929 stock market crash with a fortune and a reputation for being a shrewd financial analyst. Young was on top of the world. Young and a partner opened a securities firm. They bought securities which appeared to be worthless, reorganized the companies, and made a profit. Young reasoned, it is much easier to make one's mark in a bad situation than it is in a good one. Young didn't go home to Canadian much, but he remembered the First Presbyterian Church with an organ given in memory of his Aunt Edith. Young also restored an historic burial ground and named it Edith Ford Cemetery. Young moved his family to Florida to retire on his riches and enjoy his Palm Beach mansion, The Towers, but idleness was not for him. The Allegheny Corporation caught his eye. 2 Cleveland, Ohio brothers controlled Allegheny. O.P. and M.J. Van Swerigen sold real estate. They wanted to get people to their suburb, Shaker Heights, and increase the value of their property, so they bought the Nickel Plate Railroad for $8.5 million. Their empire crumbled in the Great Depression, but the big Eastern banks bailed the brothers out with loan after loan. Everyone was predicting bankruptcy for their holding company, but Young didn't listen. The shy boy from Texas was armed with self-assurance, gained from his prediction of the stock market crash. Opportunity was knocking. Young wasn't about to let someone else answer the door. In 1935, Allegheny was sold at a forced auction sale. George Ball, the canning jar king from Muncie, Indiana, bought the empire for $3.1 million. Young didn't bid on it. He needed more money than he was ready to risk himself. Young teamed up with Allen P. Kirby, son of a co-founder of the Woolworth Company. They bought Allegheny preferred stock for themselves and some General Motors clients, but Young couldn't get an Allegheny directorship. Guarantee Trust Company ignored his request. The damn bankers, as Young called them, became his enemies. He charged bankers were the trouble with a lot of railroads. He advocated more ownership interests.
I would say there's less real ownership management in the railroads than there is in any other great American industry.
The Van Swerigens died before they could realize their dream of building America's one transcontinental rail system. In 1937, Ball was ready to sell his controlling interest. The Van Swerigen dream, like a torch, would be passed to Young, who was ready to go the distance, and then some. Young's firm started negotiations. Before long, the buying group was at odds. GM clients wanted to oust Young. With some help from Senator Burton K. Wheeler, Young and Kirby made the deal without the others. Senator Wheeler was investigating railroad financing. He frowned on GM executives getting involved in railroad business and scared off Young's opposition. Kirby put up $3 million. The Young syndicate pledged 1,200,000 shares of common stock as security for its $2,375,000 note due in 2 years. After May 5, 1937, Young ruled Allegheny, a railroad, coal, and real estate empire. The Chesapeake and Ohio passenger train served White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. home of the C&O's famous Greenbrier Resort, conveniently located on its main line. Young dissolved his brokerage firm and became chairman of Allegheny and a director of the C&O. He settled into the Van Swearingen office on the 36th floor of the Terminal Tower in Cleveland. And then Young discovered that Allegheny didn't own its 2 million shares of stock in the rich coal-carrying C&O Railroad. The Chesapeake Corporation, an intermediate holding company, did. Guarantee Trust controlled the shares, pledged as collateral behind bonds issued when Allegheny was formed in 1929. Young decided to merge the Chesapeake and Allegheny to get the C&O shares. He also planned to consolidate the Van Swearingen railroads into a big eastern system. The day after Young took control of the Allegheny, he testified before the Senate Railroad Investigating Committee. Young said the new owners planned to eliminate 75 to 80% of the more than 200 Van Swearingen holding companies. Senator Wheeler asked Young if he would commit himself to competitive bidding in railroad securities. Young said they would shop around for the best price. Before long, Young would make competitive bidding his own crusade. Young stressed that he had no ties to any of the great banking interests of New York. J.P. Morgan and Company and Guarantee Trust had originally financed most of the Van Swearingen enterprises. Young told the Securities and Exchange Commission that Thomas W. Lamont, the senior partner of the Morgan firm, wanted to help guide him in his policies. Young later said that Lamont made him feel just like a country boy, that he literally put him on the carpet and spanked him for developing a plan without discussing it with the Morgans. Young vowed to make Morgan's a 10th-rate bank. In the fall of 1937, the market value of collateral behind the Allegheny holdings fell to the point where Guarantee Trust could seize all income and surplus cash. Young was losing control of the C&O. In his own words, he was down in heart and in mind and in body and soul. He wrote poetry while he was suffering from a black and disabling depression. Sad are my thoughts, for I am 40, sad as the drifting leaves this autumn day. Until today it seemed my path led upward, but now I find myself upon a constant downward slope, which gains in pitch until I see, dim, distantly a void, from which departed friends have turned tired faces, and love has lost its zest. The quest of fortune ended, while none but liars housed the halls of state. Young fell into a suicidal mood and was admitted to a Newport rest home for psychiatric care. Young's enemies tried to turn Kirby against him. Kirby refused to drop his partner and friend. Young was down, but he wasn't out. By the end of December 1937, he was back in the fight for control of the C&O stock. He appealed to stockholders and collected proxies. 41% of the C&O common stock thought to be enough to give him working control. Compromise gave the bank 3 seats on the board and allowed Young to dissolve the Chesapeake Corporation and distribute the C&O stock within 3 years. In the fall of 1938, Young waged a crusade to break the hold of the damn bankers over the railroads. C&O issued $30 million worth of bonds, but it wasn't business as usual. Young got a bid from Cyrus Eaton, head of Otis & Company, a Cleveland, Ohio banking firm, and a Chicago investment firm that was $1.3 million less than what Morgan Stanley wanted to finance the bonds. Young vowed to hold directors personally liable for the difference if they took the higher bid. The board went with the Midwestern Syndicate, and Young won the fight for competitive bidding. While battling New York bankers, Young, the last principal stockholder of the First National Bank of Canadian, was cutting his banking ties at home. He called Harry Samuel Wilbur Sr., president and managing officer of Southwest National Bank, and said that if he would fly to West Palm Beach the next day, they would make a deal on the First National Bank of Canadian. Wilbur's son, Earl L. Wilbur, who still owns and controls the bank, was a teenager at the time. He recalls that Young said if they made a deal, he would pay for the trip. If they didn't, his dad would pay. They made the deal. When the deal closed, Young gave his dad a Remington painting. The Texan liked to do things in a big way. Young hit ball with a $5 million lawsuit, the largest ever filed under the SEC law. He charged Ball had inflated the value of Allegheny stock when his syndicate bought it, causing them severe loss. On May 5, 1939, Allegheny's note to Ball for more than $2 million came due. And rather than pay back the note, Young and Kirby surrendered the stock to Ball. Young gave up the stock, but he didn't give up the fight. The shares were tied up in his lawsuit and neither side could vote them. In 1941, Young got a plan approved to eliminate the clause his opponents kept using to impound the C&O stock. While Young was making headway in his business affairs, he suffered a personal tragedy. On July 1, 1941, his daughter, Eleanor Jane, died in a private plane crash. Eleanor Cookie Young was called the exotic blossom of the Newport Debs, the next glamour girl, when she made her debut at Newport. Divorced after she was secretly married in 1939, Eleanor was seeing a 31-year-old Greek shipping magnate who was separated from his wife. He was piloting his private plane when it crashed in heavy fog on a trip from Newport to Long Island. The loss plunged Young into uncontrollable grief. He wrote to his longest and closest friend, Ed, who also had loved ones die at a young age. Aside from our friendship, you are a natural place for me to find sympathy because of Tom and Anna. I have sought consolation by every device my ingenuity of mind can conceive, but always I come back to what seems a grief that is unbearable. Nell did not regain consciousness. It was a merciful death. 1 minute happy and gay, the next never to be unhappy again. I have cursed myself for not forbidding her to fly in a private plane. I disapproved even of commercial planes. She was fearless but not foolhardy, loved to fly, and was bored to tears by a train. Yet even in the fog there were so many easy ways out that one cannot help but feel fate would have it so. I suppose all of us who lose loved ones think their loss is greater than man was ever called upon to bear. But ours was a close little family, and we had pinned so much of our future upon Eleanor's that the gap is a great one. Well, I suppose the hot Texas wind will be blowing when this reaches you, as it was at the time of Papa's illness, as it was on those carefree days when we lay in the shade of the buckboard on Sand Creek, and as it will be when we join Tom, Anna, Eleanor, and the rest. Love to you all, from us all, sincerely, Punk. Young's cousin, Mary Catherine Behringer, recalled the last time she saw Young.
It was at his sister's house in Beverly Hills after the death of his daughter. We had a quiet family visit. I was in my 20s. I felt that Ralph was drawn to me because I was close to Eleanor Jane's age. Her death was a very deep wound he never got over.
On December 17, 1941, the C&O closed the Greenbrier doors to the public. The U.S. State Department temporarily housed enemy diplomats there. In March of 1942, Young closed the book on his battle with Ball when Ball paid Young and Kirby over $4 million in Allegheny stocks and other securities, including the 1,200,000 shares from their 1939 deal. Young became chairman of the C&O board. On his first trip as board chairman over the C&O, Young decided that not even the famous Chessie cat, C&O's mascot since 1933, could sleep on mountain grades in the passenger cars in use. Young told his advertising department to play down their motto, "Sleep like a kitten." Young and the C&O board of directors would promise the traveling public post-war passenger service second to none, with new bedroom cars to replace the open-section sleeping car, and new streamlined lightweight coaches. In 1942, the Youngs bought Fairholme, a 40-room Tudor mansion at Newport, Rhode Island. Young spent 4 days a week there, 3 days in his New York apartment, and the winter in Florida. Young preferred to work at card tables at home. Young took the same 3-mile walk every day with a pet dog and watched the seagulls through binoculars. He believed in time alone. We cannot hope to solve today's complex problems without thought. But where and when are we taught the virtue of solitude, without which constructive thought is scarcely possible? To be alone has almost become to be eccentric. My best work is done in an hour's walk along the ocean. The C&O reopened the Greenbrier in 1942 in mid-July for 6 weeks, but the season was cut short. In August, the government took the Greenbrier under the War Powers Act and turned it into a military hospital. The C&O was paid $3.3 million for the resort and 7,000 acres of land. When magazines were filled with war ads, the C&O ran an ad campaign on free enterprise. Young's "The Trunk of the Tree" ad showed how the town grew like a tree and the trunk was the railroad. The ad was against government control of the railroads. On March 6, 1945, an ICC report concluded that Allegheny, Young, and Kirby were in illegal control of the C&O lines and must divest themselves of the railroads. They reportedly lost control before September 1940, when the Transportation Act took effect, and regained control without ICC approval. Not one to sit and wait, Young put together a plan of attack in case the full commission ruled against him. Pullman Company was found to have a monopoly on the manufacture and service of sleeping cars. Pullman wanted the railroads to buy the sleeping car service. The New York Central Railroad, in the Vanderbilt family since the 1860s, when Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt became its president, wanted to buy the sleeping car service. But the Pennsylvania Railroad wanted to own and operate its own sleeping cars. So Young offered to be the buyer. Pullman fit into his dream for transcontinental service. It was not uncommon for Young to have many irons in the fire. While aiming for Pullman, he worked out a plan to retain control of the C&O lines. The ICC approved it. Young had saved Allegheny. Now Pullman was at the top of his takeover list. Pullman's president wouldn't deal with Young. Young didn't take no for an answer. On August 27, 1945, he went to court with a proposal to buy the Pullman sleeping car service. The New York Central organized a railroad buying group and made Pullman an offer. Pullman said no because there were strings attached. When Young made a $75 million cash, no-strings-attached offer, the railroad buying group withdrew the conditions. Pullman accepted its new offer. Young and Kirby vowed to take their case to the ICC and the Supreme Court. Then, Young took his fight to the traveling public. Young ran this ad, telling readers, "An invisible line divides America." In 1946, Advertising Age named Young Advertising Man of the Year for his hog ad. Regulations prevented a hog from crossing the country without changing trains. They had to be detrained, fed, and rested. But Young's ad struck a note to which he knew the public would respond. To stop the underground sale of sleeping car space, the C&O said follow the lead of the airlines and sell or reserve space only in the name of the person who plans to use it. C&O called on other railroads to cooperate. Both the Central and Pennsylvania railroads instituted through Pullman service at Chicago and St. Louis. But it didn't last because of the complex connections. It wasn't the service Young hoped for.
I helped put that over, although it is not very effective today. I'm a little bit ashamed of it.
Young charged the sleepers were as out-of-date as high-button shoes. He wanted uniform standards for sleeping cars to save time and money on orders. Young promoted luxury trains to lure rail travelers back. The trains were 40 minutes faster. Every coach had a smoking lounge. These seats were known as the seats that went to college because thousands of tests were conducted at a famous university. When Young's Pure Marquette put 2 new maize and blue streamliners on its Detroit Grand Rapids run, people left their cars and rode the train. While Young was a hero to the traveling public, he wasn't any closer to owning Pullman. Young's efforts to rally other railroads behind his calls for action failed. In October of 1946, the C&O Railroad withdrew from the Association of American Railroads. With the end of World War II, the Army closed the Ashford General Hospital. Young led the effort to get the C&O to buy it back. He hired New York City decorator Dorothy Draper to refurbish the Greenbrier. In February of 1947, Young warned that the railroads were on the verge of physical and financial collapse.
The reasons are, first, the dry rot that comes from non-ownership, Wall Street control. And second, unintelligent, insincere, politically influenced regulation in Washington.
Young announced the formation of the Federation for Railway Progress. It would become the platform for his views. Young never stopped dreaming up ways to get the traveling public to take the train. He came up with what he called the finest day train in the world, run between Washington, D.C. and Cincinnati, Ohio, the Chessie. It featured carpeted coaches with 10-position seats, radios that couldn't be overheard by other passengers, cartoons in the family car, a soda fountain in the tavern lounge lunch counter car. 3 streamlined coal-fired turbine locomotives were ordered. The price tag, $590,000 each. It was one thing for other railroads not to get behind Young's ideas. To lead the opposition against him was another. That was what the Central had done in forming the Railroad Buying Group to fight Young for Pullman sleeping car service. But Young was not about to be beaten by the Central. He decided if he couldn't buy Pullman, then he would buy the New York Central. It fit with his dream of coast-to-coast train travel. With the coal-rich C&O freight business and the Central passenger business, he could have it all. When the Supreme Court upheld the Railroad Buying Group's bid for Pullman, Young had the throttle wide open. It was full steam ahead in his battle for the Central. He believed the ICC would approve his bid for a seat on the Central, but the ICC's assistant finance director recommended against it. Young would appeal to the full commission. While waiting for delivery of the Chessie trains, Young announced that the C&O was designing a new lightweight train that would cut transcontinental time in half with no reduction in safety and compete with planes.
I look forward to the day when that trip will be done in one business day and 2 nights, so that you will not lose any more time away from your business than you do presently by airplane.
Train X would have shorter cars that could take curves faster and safer. Its center of gravity would be lowered by 1.5 feet. A feature in use on roller coasters since 1880 would supplement the lower center of gravity in making speeds of 120 miles an hour as safe as present speeds with present equipment. Young knew the public was more likely to take the train if it was fast. On April 15, 1948, Young made headlines on the society pages and in major magazines with his gala reopening party at the Greenbrier for 300 guests. His personal friends, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, attended. Young hosted a golf match featuring celebrities like Bing Crosby and Young's motion picture business associate, J. Arthur Rank. Young's Pathé Industries and its subsidiary, Eagle Lion Films, distributed Rank's film The Adventurous, starring Deborah Kerr. Young and his wife danced at the Diamond Ball. On May 10, 1948, the ICC Commission rejected Young's request for seats on the Central Board. The Central hadn't heard the last of him. "I'm just a little boy from Texas, trying to bring the public the kind of service it deserves and give the railroads back to the people." In mid-1948, the Chessie train went on display at major cities along the Chessie route, but the C&O could not compete with the airlines. Cost overruns and delays in the delivery of the Chessie train equipment forced the C&O to cancel the Chessie before its maiden trip. Most of the equipment was sold to other railroads. The M1 locomotives, the heaviest and largest steam locomotives ever built, were scrapped. How did Young feel about selling off and scrapping the train of his dreams? A former top public relations official for the C&O says Young was a realist, not a sentimentalist. Young did what he had to do and continued with his crusade to make train service better. None of Young's innovations, no tipping, picking up tickets on trains, a credit card system, or movies were successful on C&O passenger trains. Young blamed C&O's small passenger business. With the Central, things would be different. Young's critics argued that the Atlantic Coastline was the first railroad to show movies, and that there were 3 credit card plans when Young announced his. But no one pressed forward with the persistence of Young.
Unfortunately, I have had a good bit of opposition, most of which has stemmed from a certain group here in the East who are extremely influential in the railroads and who did not like, for example, the competitive bidding innovation which I introduced into the sale of railway securities. That cost them a lot of money, and they've been opposing me ever since.
Young had kept his promise to the traveling public to provide new all-room sleepers and the latest in luxury coaches on every C&O mainline through train. Young called for a revolution in railroad thinking, insisting Train X should have been completed a generation ago. Deficits were zooming in 1947, soaring in 1951, with railroad investors losing hundreds of millions of dollars operating passenger train service, which included the costly hauling of mail, baggage, and express. But Young didn't blame the competition for getting a better deal. He blamed the ICC and the railroads for not educating the public.
Your railroads need your help.
Young called for the elimination of branch line trains no longer needed because of the auto and bus. Young pushed to get the trucks on the rails and to adopt roller bearings, which need to be greased only once in 3 years for freight cars. Young argued there was no reason to keep a railroad car 4 feet 3 inches above the rail, the height of the freight platform to receive the first bale of cotton in 1830. Pullman Standard spent $500,000 building the first model of Train X, then stopped further development because key railroads were against lowering station platforms. Young vowed to go forward with Train X. In 1952, Young's Train X car made test runs to demonstrate its speed. Among the passengers, Young and Kenneth Brown, the car's chief designer, who worked in the aviation industry until he became C&O's research director in 1944. In August of 1952, the Central named a new president who could handle the Central's finance and traffic problems, and Young. William White, president of the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western, hired on the Erie Railroad at age 16. Young continued to buy stock in the Central and to make his case for a seat on the Central board in newspaper ads. On January 19, 1954, Young, Kirby, and 4 others resigned from the C&O and sold the Allegheny holdings in the C&O to Cyrus Eaton, who was elected chairman in place of Young. Young was free to acquire control of another carrier. He warned the Central board he would start a proxy fight if he didn't get 2 seats. The Central said no. White pledged a bare-fisted fight. Young predicted victory. Young and White appeared on network news programs. Young hammered away at the fact that White was hired to run a railroad, not a proxy fight. White retorted he had been running the railroad and would continue to run it, but not from Palm Beach or Newport. Young blasted White's 10-year contract with the Central, pointing out that while he had sought independence, he never sought security, or he wouldn't have left DuPont, GM, Wall Street, and then the C&O. Young appealed to ethnic groups and nominated Lila Bell Atchison Wallace, co-owner with her husband of the Reader's Digest, to his slate. While the C&O owned 800,000 shares of Central stock, it was trusted to the Chase National Bank, whose president was also a Central director and not likely to vote the stock for Young. In what Young called the cleverest deal in his financial history, he got the stock. Young's Allegheny Corporation, Kirby, and a group of banks loaned 2 Texans, Sid W. Richardson and Clint W. Murchison, $20 million to buy the 800,000 shares and vote them for Young at the May 26 Central meeting. While the Central's management was asking the ICC to look into the stock deal, Young was suing the Central to get the directors to pay for the proxy fight out of their own pockets. The ICC refused to investigate the stock sale. The Central lost its bid for an injunction to stop the Chase Bank from turning over the proxies and a last-ditch appeal to delay the meeting. The railroad vowed to be in court while the stockholders' meeting was in progress. Special trains took Central stockholders and reporters to Albany, New York for the annual meeting. There were banners and buttons, Young at heart, or We Want White. White got in some last-minute campaigning for votes on the train. Thousands of proxy ballots to be voted by the Central arrived in a guarded baggage car. Young arrived confident of a victory in his bid to oust the present central management. Young's proxies arrived by armored car. To the Washington Avenue Armory, 800 shareholders were expected, twice the usual number, but 2,000 stockholders packed the armory for the showdown vote. Central President William White presided over the meeting. Management's candidates were placed into nomination, then Young's. When news reached the Armory that the appellate court would not reconsider the ruling on the 800,000 shares or postpone the meeting in progress, Young claimed victory. Young won, even without the 800,000 proxies from Murchison and Richardson. There were no more Vanderbilts on the Commodore's Railroad. The new board elected Young chairman at the annual salary of $1. The board waived all directors and executive committee fees until the Central was paying higher dividends. Under new management, the Central's 1955 net income was $52 million, the highest since 1943. But Young and his new Central president, Alfred Perlman, who saved the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad, pointed out that the earnings showed a one-time federal income tax benefit. They slashed jobs and passenger service as Young tried to deliver on his promise to boost dividends. Airlines topped rail coach travel in 1954 and made new gains in 1955. The railroads countered with GM's sleek, speedy, low center of gravity Aero train. The air-conditioned coach train was tested by the Central and Pennsylvania railroads in simultaneous exhibition runs on January 5, 1956. The 400-passenger Aero train pulled by a high-powered diesel engine cut costs as well as time. The day finally came for Young and his Train X. The Explorer went into service between Cleveland and Cincinnati. The price of Central stock had shot up to $49.50 a share. But there was a sharp drop in freight car loadings in 1957 because of the economic recession in heavy industry. Plus, the Central had to compete with the newly completed New York State Thruway. In the fall of 1957, Young and Perlman decided consolidation was the only way to save the Central. The longtime rival railroads were considering a merger. Young was fighting for more than the Central's survival. Young and Kirby were charged with manipulating the Allegheny Corporation for their personal profit in a series of stockholder suits growing out of the Central proxy fight. A great deal of Young's stock was tied up in a lawsuit involving the recapitalization plan for Allegheny. Young had been selling Central stock and his holdings plunged from 100,200 shares to 1,200 shares. The price of Central common stock had dropped to a low of $13.50 in late 1957. Young and other Central directors held a special meeting in Palm Beach on January 20, 1958. Earnings had plunged. For the first time since Young took over the Central, the directors voted not to pay a dividend for the next quarter. It was shattering to Young's pride. The case involving frozen Allegheny stock was decided in Young's favor, but he never knew it. On January 25th, Young ended his life with a blast from a shotgun in the billiard room of his Palm Beach mansion. There was no suicide note. His wife told police that he had been despondent. Friends and the media speculated that Young was ill, depressed, because he couldn't keep his promises to stockholders, that he realized his dream for coast-to-coast passenger service was not shared by the traveling public, now sold on cars and planes. Tricia Exum was married to Frank Exum, Young's nephew.
As far as Uncle Bob being ill prior to his death, I think the general consensus at the time was that he never fully recovered from Eleanor's death and suffered serious bouts of depression. No one could ever really put a finger on any one thing that would cause him to kill himself.
Young once wrote of death, "No dank churchyard for me. I would toss in the sparkling sea." But Young would be buried in the family plot next to his daughter. Private car number 28, the car Young planned many winning fights in, made its last journey to Newport. Young was a scrapper who always fought hard. He was a force for progress in the railroad industry. preferred to be called a businessman, not a railroad man. He wanted to be remembered as the man who gave the country some decent railroad service and rescued it from what he called the horrors of filthy cattle cars. The January 1958 Central Headlight published a statement Young made for a 20-year time capsule. Young predicted rail freight service would be a high-density mainline operation, that passenger speed freight trains would end their runs on the outskirts of big cities, and from there, trucks like the Central's flexi vans would handle the short haul. Young predicted passenger service would be limited to mainline operations between big cities, with the bulk of travel in intermediate hauls, in lightweight, low center of gravity coach equipment. He believed the long-distance trip in luxury first-class sleeping equipment could be preserved without the freight service picking up the tab. On February 1, 1968, the New York Central and Pennsylvania merged to form the Penn Central Transportation Company. 2 months later, an equivalent share of Central stock in the new company sold for $105. On May 1, 1971, railroads, including Penn Central, got out of the passenger service business. Amtrak, formed by congressional action, took passengers where Young wanted a railroad to take them, clear across the country. In 1976, bankrupt railroads, including the Penn Central, turned over their assets to the Consolidated Rail Corporation known as Conrail, which was also formed by congressional action. On the issue of consolidation of 131 railroads, Young was ahead of his time. His prediction that there would be 2 major railroads in the East came true, but it wasn't the Central and the Pennsylvania. In 1998, the way was cleared for Conrail to be purchased by Norfolk Southern and CSX, which began as the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad.
Security. Sometimes it don't pay to follow, and I know you gotta step right up and take the lead. And when I hit that brick wall of opposition, I gotta push, shove, prod, plead and believe. It don't pay to just stand here marking time, 'cause I got a dream the size of Texas. I'm running this show. Give me independence, not security. I ain't looking back, and that's the way it's gotta be. I know what I'm talking about. Somebody listen to me. Give me independence, not security. I know what I'm talking about. Somebody listen to me. Give me independence, not security.